And here's what Jesus taught. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. If Jesus commanded us to love our enemies, how much more should we seek to understand those who actually worship the same God we do, even if we disagree on theology? Now, some Christians will say, but they reject the Trinity, they reject Jesus as Lord. Yes, they do. And that's a fundamental disagreement. But think about this. The early church dealt with theological disagreements all the time. Between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, between different interpretations of doctrine. And how did Jesus say the world would know we're his disciples? By your love for one another. Not by winning every theological argument, not by proving who's right, by love. When you understand that Muslims are sincerely seeking God, even if you believe they're mistaken about Jesus' nature, it should create empathy, not hostility. You don't have to agree with someone's theology to treat them with dignity and respect. You don't have to compromise your beliefs to acknowledge their sincere faith. And when Christians and Muslims can talk about God, about morality, about raising faithful children in a secular world, we discover we're fighting many of the same battles, just from different trenches. 2. Muslims in America are defending the same values Christians claim to care about. Here's something that's going to blow your mind. On almost every major cultural issue that Christians say they care about, Muslims are your allies, not your enemies. Let me list them out. Opposition to abortion. Muslims generally oppose it. Support for traditional family structures. Muslims champion them. Concern about sexual content in media and schools. Muslims are fighting that battle. Opposition to alcohol and drug culture. Muslims don't drink. It's forbidden. It's forbidden. Emphasis on modesty and sexual purity before marriage. That's central to Islamic teaching. Respect for parental authority, commanded in the Quran. Religious education for children. Muslims build entire school systems around it. So what are so many Christians treating Muslims like they're the enemy when they're actually fighting for the same values? I'll tell you why. Because we've been conditioned to see them as threats instead of recognizing them as potential partners. Think about it logically. You've got Christian parents concerned about LGBT curriculum being pushed on their kids in schools. You've got Muslim parents with the same concern. You've got Christian communities trying to maintain religious freedom in an increasingly secular culture. You've got Muslim communities fighting that same battle. You've got Christians alarmed about the breakdown of the family. You've got Muslims working desperately to preserve strong families in the same culture. Here's what I witnessed. In city after city, when there were school board meetings about controversial curriculum, who was showing up alongside Christian parents, Muslim parents. When there were fights about religious accommodation in workplaces, who was standing with Christians defending religious liberty? Muslims. When there were initiatives to help the homeless, to fight addiction, to support struggling families, Muslims were there, working shoulder to shoulder with Christian organizations. But we never hear about this because it doesn't fit the narrative. The media wants us divided. Politicians benefit from us being at each other's throats. But the truth is that on core values, on protecting children, strengthening families, maintaining moral standards, and preserving religious freedom, Christians and Muslims are natural allies. Now, does this mean we agree on everything? Of course not. There are theological differences that can't be bridged. There are cultural practices that might make some Christians uncomfortable, and vice versa. But Jesus didn't call us to only work with people who agree with us on everything. And he called us to be peacemakers. He called us to love our neighbors. And when your Muslim neighbor is fighting to keep their daughter modest and focused on education instead of social media and hookup culture, that's the same fight you're fighting as a Christian parent. When your Muslim colleague is trying to maintain integrity in a corrupt business environment, that's the same battle you're fighting. We have been manipulated into seeing each other as enemies when we should be seeing each other as allies in a culture war that threatens both our communities. It's time to wake up and recognize who the real threats to religious faith and family values are, and they're not coming from the mosque. Hush, 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 hush. 3. The extremism you fear is condemned by the Muslims you know. Let's address the elephant in the room: terrorism. Christian fear of Islam is often rooted in images of 9/11, ISIS, and terrorist attacks. That fear is real, and I'm not going to dismiss it. But here's what you must understand. The Muslims living in your community are just as horrified by terrorism as you are, maybe more so because it's done in the name of their faith. Imagine if every time a person claiming to be Christian committed violence, bombed an abortion clinic, shot up a church, led a cult to mass suicide, you were held personally responsible. Imagine if every Christian in America had to constantly apologize for the Crusades, for the Inquisition, for the KKK, who claimed Christian justification, for every act of violence ever committed by someone claiming to follow Christ. You'd be exhausted, you'd be frustrated, you'd say, that's not my Christianity, I don't believe that, I condemn that. That's exactly how American Muslims feel. Every major Muslim organization in America, every single one has condemned terrorism repeatedly, explicitly, and forcefully. The Islamic Society of North America, the Council on American Islamic Relations, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, they've all issued statement after statement denouncing extremism. Individual Muslims have launched campaigns, educational programs, and community initiatives to fight radicalization. Muslim scholars have written volumes explaining why terrorism violates Islamic law. But when was the last time you saw that on the news? When was the last time a Christian leader acknowledged it? We amplify the voices of extremists and ignore the voices of the 99.9% of Muslims who are peaceful, law-abiding, faithful people. Here's the reality. Muslims in America are more likely to report potential terrorist activity than any other group because they have the most to lose. When there's a terrorist attack, who faces the backlash? Muslim communities. Mosques get vandalized. Muslim women wearing hijabs get harassed. Muslim children get bullied. Muslim businesses get boycotted. American Muslims are desperately trying to fight extremism because it threatens their safety, their reputation, and their ability to practice their faith freely. They're not secretly sympathizing with terrorists. They're victims of terrorism's impact on their community. And when Christians fail to acknowledge that, when we treat every Muslim as a potential threat, we're not being vigilant. We're being unchristian. Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners. He touched lepers. He talked with Samaritans. He saw people as individuals, not as monolithic threats. And he calls us to do the same. Under faith, understanding doesn't weaken your faith. It strengthens your witness. Here's where I need to challenge some Christians directly. I hear this fear that if you understand Islam, if you build relationships with Muslims, if you acknowledge common ground, you're somehow compromising the gospel. That's nonsense. That's fear masquerading as faithfulness. Listen to me. You can be firmly committed to Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior and treat Muslims with respect, dignity, and love. These things are not in conflict. They're required by the gospel. Think about the Apostle Paul. Now apply that to Muslim-Christian relations in America. What if, instead of seeing Muslims as threats, Christians saw them as neighbors Jesus calls us to love? What if, instead of avoiding Muslims, Christians intentionally built friendships with them? What if, instead of condemning from a distance, Christians got close enough to understand their struggles, their hopes, their humanity? Here's what would happen. Muslims would encounter the actual love of Christ, not just the rhetoric. They'd see Christians who practice what they preach. They'd experience the kingdom of God breaking into their lives through acts of service, kindness, and genuine care. And that's when hearts open. That's when people become curious about the faith that produces such love. That's when the gospel moves from being abstract theology to lived reality. But it requires Christians to get uncomfortable. It requires stepping out of your safe community and into relationship with people who are different. It requires replacing fear with faith, suspicion with curiosity, judgment with grace. And here's the beautiful thing. When you do this, when you engage Muslims as Jesus would, with love, respect, and genuine interest, you don't just create opportunities to share the gospel. You become more like Christ in the process. You develop the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. You learn what it really means to love your neighbor. You discover that the gospel isn't just something you believe, it's something you live. And in a world that's increasingly divided, increasingly hostile, increasingly tribal, Christians who love across religious boundaries become living testimonies to the power of the gospel to transform hearts and heal divisions. That's not compromising your faith. That's demonstrating it at the highest level. So here's what I'm calling you to do. Every Christian listening to this, I'm calling you to courage. The courage to step outside your comfort zone. The courage to have a conversation with a Muslim coworker instead of avoiding them. The courage to invite a Muslim neighbor over for dinner and ask genuine questions about their faith. The courage to defend Muslims when they're being stereotyped or attacked, not because you agree with Islam, but because you believe in the dignity of every human being created in God's image. I'm calling you to curiosity, to read about Islam with an open mind, to visit a mosque during an open house, to ask questions not to argue but to understand, to recognize that you can learn from people without agreeing with everything they believe, to become the kind of Christian who's so secure in their faith that they're not threatened by understanding others. And most importantly, I'm calling you to love. Not weak, sentimental love. Not tolerant acceptance that ignores differences. But strong, Christ-like love that sees people as they truly are, as beloved creations of God who need the gospel just like we all did. Love that builds bridges instead of walls. Love that listens instead of lectures. Love that serves without expecting anything in return. Love that reflects the heart of Jesus who loved us while we were still sinners. Because here's the bottom line. The world is watching how Christians treat Muslims, and what they see will either confirm or contradict everything we say about the gospel. If we claim to follow the Prince of Peace but spread fear, they'll call us hypocrites. But if we love boldly, serve sacrificially, and engage courageously, we'll demonstrate that the gospel is real, that Jesus transforms hearts, and that Christianity offers hope for a divided world. The question isn't whether Muslims belong in America. They're here, and they're your neighbors. The question is, will Christians respond with fear or with faith? With isolation or with engagement? With judgment or with love? Your answer to that question will determine not just the future of Muslim-Christian relations in this country. It will determine whether the world sees Jesus in you or just another religious person protecting their territory. Now, get out there and love like Christ loved. Understand like Paul understood. Engage like the early church engaged. And watch what God does when his people stop being afraid and start being the salt and light he called us to be. 1. Shared monotheistic foundation. Muslims and Christians worship the same God of Abraham, though we disagree fundamentally on Jesus' divinity and the Trinity. Creating common ground for respectful dialogue while maintaining theological differences. 2. Aligned values in cultural battles. Muslims in America defend traditional family values, oppose abortion, champion modesty and sexual purity, and fight against secular culture's excess, making them natural allies for Christians on most social issues. 3. Extremism is not mainstream. The vast majority of American Muslims condemn terrorism and extremism, actively work to prevent radicalization, and suffer backlash from terrorist attacks, yet are constantly asked to apologize for actions they oppose. 4. Understanding strengthens witness. Learning about Islam and building genuine relationships with Muslims doesn't compromise Christian faith. It deepens it, creates opportunities for gospel witness, and demonstrates Christ-like love in action. The Great Commission demands engagement. Christians cannot fulfill Jesus' command to make disciples of all nations while remaining ignorant about or isolated from Muslims, who represent a significant and growing mission field requiring understanding and relationship.